So first, I'd just like to thank you for having me, and you could probably skip right to slide two if you want to. The first one's just an introduction. Um, and I think this is a really important topic, at least it has been here. And my first slide, which hopefully you'll see soon, um, is basically a shout out to Michael Desmond, whose amazing book, Eviction, really changed the landscape and public policy here in America because it brought attention to an issue of eviction and how it affects people that really many of us have been trying for decades to do that we haven't been able to do. And so the problem received the kind of public attention that it did, I think, largely because of Michael's book and his, no, I don't see the slides yet. Largely because of his book, but also because of the project that he created after he wrote the book. He won a MacArthur grant, which is sort of known as the Genius Grant. And he used that money to create something called eviction.org, the Eviction Lab, that has been tracking evictions in America since right before the COVID crisis, really. And that, again, has been very important in bringing public attention to the situation. Should I wait till you can get those up, or?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties, but I hope that I can start sharing the slides as soon as possible. I'm changing Wi-Fi networks of my other computer. Hopefully that works.
Yeah, they worked before. So while she's trying to do that, I'll just sort of give you a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to talk kind of about the macro issue of eviction, around COVID and what's happened, and then take a step back and give you the picture of the micro edition. There we go. There's Evicted, and we can move to the next one now too, and then give you the little micro picture. So as strange as it sounds, the other thing that kind of helped our situation with COVID was the foreclosure crisis that, at least for us, began, in around 2008, and some parts of our country earlier than that. And why that helped is it sparked an awful lot of research about the negative effects of housing loss, and especially in the social sciences and medical professions. Now, I think those professions have always known, or have known for a long time, about the connections between housing and good health, right? But a lot of that research really picked up, and a lot of it was done during the during the foreclosure crisis, and a lot of that research was used when COVID came around to support the need to do something to prevent evictions. So the next slide, please. And then I think, to me, a really important piece of this is what I consider a problem that we have, at least here in America, where we look at housing as a commodity, as an investment, right? Something that you buy and invest in. You're not entitled to it. It's one of those things that if you've got the money to have it, great. If you don't, well, that's your problem. Instead of looking at housing as a right, something that everybody should be entitled to, at least at some level. And those two, the tensions of those have really been playing back and forth in American policy for many, many years. And we really lean very heavily towards this idea of housing being some kind of a investment vehicle, and that being more important. It's an economic asset, and that part of it is more important than the actual housing part. Okay, so next slide then. So I'm going to start with sort of the governmental response to COVID. So the first thing that happened here in the U.S. is something that's called the CARES Act, and you can move on to the next slide when you get a chance. And the CARES Act did a couple things. First of all, it created a short 120-day moratorium on all evictions. And we're talking about rentals, but in case anybody's interested, there were also multiple similar programs for mortgage holders. So what this little mini moratorium did, it only covered properties that had a federally related mortgage on them. So if the landlord had a mortgage that was backed by a government guarantee, FHA, USDA, VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, then the landlord couldn't evict anyone for non-payment of rent. It also put in the requirement that you had to give 30 days notice before you could evict people, which is not common in many parts of the country, especially where I live. And you also could not charge any late fees or penalties during the 90-day period from the 30 days notice to the 120 days when you could evict. It only applied to non-payment of rent cases. So if the landlord was claiming to evict you for some other reason, they could. This program was really slow getting started for a whole number of reasons. It was very cumbersome because in order to be able to access the money, communities or not-for-profits, a lot of these really were community cities that applied for the money. You had to apply for a grant. And then you had to have the infrastructure. You had to have already some kind of infrastructure in place to be able to administer the grant, which, some places did, some places didn't. The landlord also had to agree to cooperate, and you would be surprised how many landlords didn't agree. And by cooperating, what I mean is that they were going to help you get money to pay the rent, and some landlords just wouldn't cooperate with that. So that really seems bizarre to me and to many other people, but many of the reasons that landlords at least stated that they wouldn't accept the money, one of them was just a political reason. They didn't believe the government should be involved in housing. Some of them claimed they didn't want to have to give the government the information that was required in order to get the money. And then there was, at least in most communities, there was a provision, if you accepted the money, that you wouldn't evict anybody unless they became 3 months late on the rent. And many landlords said, no, that's a bridge too far. We're not going to do that. So next slide, please. So in addition to the federal moratorium, which was, again, limited, many states, and this is a map that I did in 2020, all of the states that have colors are states that at least put some kind of moratorium in place against eviction. The darker greens and the lighter greens all expired at sometimes in 2020. California was supposed to expire in 2021, and you'll see in a minute that actually they expanded that. And then Nevada and I believe it was New Jersey kind of left theirs open-ended, but they have expired at this point. So those were broader. Those state moratoriums basically stopped any eviction for non-payment of rent. And I think that piece is very important because many low-income clients, and that's who I've been dealing with for 30 years, many low-income clients don't have leases. They're month-to-month tenants. And so a landlord could evict them simply by saying, the month is up, I don't want to rent to them anymore. So there was a really large loophole for all of these. Some states were stricter about those, but for the most part, that was a real problem for states or for people who wanted to keep people from being evicted. All right, next slide. So most of these have expired, but there's a list of several states here that still have some kind of diversion program. And I'm going to talk about California because it's a really big state, but what California is doing is very similar to what many of the other states are doing. And basically, it's a kind of a pretrial diversion program. So everywhere in the states, you have to go to court to evict somebody. Now, there are informal evictions. In other words, you let the tenant know that they're going to be evicted, and if they move out, then you don't go to court. But if they don't move out, you have to go to court. So what the pretrial diversion programs are doing is they're saying, as so long as the tenant has applied for rental assistance and they're waiting for that rental assistance to come in, you can't evict them. And most of the states that I mentioned here are doing that. Indiana's is a little wacky because the landlord still has to agree, where the other states are, the landlord doesn't have to agree that he's going to wait. He just has to wait. And some of them, like Oregon, just have sort of this hold out there that you have to wait 60 days while the assistance is coming. Part of this is because, as I mentioned before, this assistance that was funded by the federal government has taken a long time to get up and running. And as a result, there's often real delays in the time that someone applies for the rental assistance and actually gets it. Okay, next slide, please. So the next big step, basically, by the federal government to try to stem the number of evictions that were happening. And again, a lot of this has to do, as I'm sure everybody understands across the world, we had the COVID shutdowns. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people weren't working. A lot of parents had to stay home because the kids' schools weren't in session. So a lot of people had lost income, plus the fact that people were dying and losing income that way, and people were getting sick and being in the hospital and losing income that way. So this was all really related to this loss of income situation. So the next step was the Center for Disease Control, and this happened in two steps. In September, September 2020, they issued a moratorium on evictions. And this was by regulation, and it applied to people whose income was 80% below the mean. At least one it had to be COVID related, and at least one person in the household had to be likely to be homeless or likely to lose their home, somehow related to COVID. So it could be you became unemployed. It could be because you got sick. It could be because someone else in the house whose income you were depending on got sick. It could be because you got a lot of medical bills from being sick. And in order to qualify for this, you had to fill out an affidavit and give it to your landlord. The affidavit said, I've got some COVID reason that I can't pay you the rent. I'll pay you as much as I can, even if it's not the full amount. And I'm applying for all assistance that might be available. Besides the federal government, some states and not-for-profits also were giving rental assistance during this time. Some still are, actually. And you also had to say that you were going to be homeless or have to move in with relatives if you got evicted. Now, first of all, there was a huge disparity across the country about how this thing was enforced. Some courts were blocking all evictions. Some courts were being really crazy. One of the stories that I witnessed here in South Bend wasn't my case, but a friend of mine was representing the tenant. This was a case of a man who was in hospice in his home, bedridden, dying, and the judge evicted him because he said he couldn't prove he'd be homeless if he wasn't evicted, which was clearly never the intent of this regulation. So some judges were really quite harsh in how they interpreted this. Okay, next slide, please. The legal rationale for this Ddc moratorium came from a statute that gave the department the ability to make and enforce regulations, as in his judgment, being the secretary of the agency, necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases. So many legal challenges were brought across the country about whether the CDC actually had the legal authority to do this. And a lot of that discussion focused around this notion of make and enforce regulation in his judgment, right? And whether this kind of regulation was supported by the statute. There's another section after this that talks about things like eliminating rats and things like that, vaccinations, things like that. And a lot of, and I'm going back to that research done during the eviction crisis, a lot of the reasoning that the government gave to do this had to do with that research that found the connection between unstable housing and the spread of disease. And there was also a lot of evidence from the flu epidemic of 1918. And what was learned about how airborne pathogens spread, and the concern that people who had to move in with relatives would be spreading the disease, living in close corners. People who were homeless would be spreading the disease to the community. People who had to go around looking for homes could be spreading the disease around. Okay, next slide, please. So multiple landlord-tenant agencies, as I mentioned, filed lawsuits. And they had differing results across the country. Some judges said that there was authority. Some judges said there wasn't authority. And this case became the most important, really, the Alabama Association of Realtors versus the Department of Health and Human Services. So the lower court agreed that there was authority and put in basically a moratorium, or basically said that the CDC moratorium stands and you guys have to abide by it. So that they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 2021. And at that point in time, by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court agreed, essentially not to hear the case, to let the moratorium stand. And important in that decision was Judge Kavanaugh voted to let the moratorium stand, and he wrote a special note saying that he was doing this because it was going to expire anyway in a few weeks. We needed to give a little more time for the money that Congress had allocated to help people to be appropriated, and that, when it expires, he was sure Congress would re-up it because they're the ones that had the authority to do it. Well, our Congress is completely dysfunctional these days, and so nothing happened. They didn't create another moratorium through lawmaking, and so the CDC extended their moratorium. The Alabama Association appealed again to the Supreme Court in August, and at that point, the Supreme Court, Judge Kavanaugh, switched sides. And so this time it was a 5-4 vote in the other direction, and they said that the CDC moratorium was illegal, and that one ended. Okay. So, as I said, at this point in time, the only actual moratorium on evictions are those variety of state programs out there. There are a couple of local communities that have put things in effect too, but for the most part, there's no widespread prevention of eviction. All right, next slide, please. So what the Congress did do is create 2 new pockets of money called the emergency rental assistance. There was $25 billion in the first bill, $21.5 billion in the next bill. And this is very, very, very similar to the previous bills. So again, you're eligible for the money. And this, by the way, you can ask for this if you're a renter or a mortgage. You can't pay your rent, can't pay your mortgage. So you have to have some COVID-related hardship, unemployment, loss of income due to cover, medical expenses, all the same things as before. You have to have the below average median income for your area. You have to be facing homelessness. The difference here is, as opposed to just paying what was past due, this program will pay up to a month's rent ahead of time, right? So if you're, couldn't pay your rent this month, it will pay your rent for the next year to your landlord. Another difference that many states, local groups, governments put into place is there was a lot of problem in the first batch of money getting government entities to cooperate. Not government entities, I apologize. Getting landlords to cooperate. Because the provision in the first round of money, the money had to go directly to the landlord. So what this bill did, many communities put in a provision that if the landlord won't cooperate, we'll just give the money to the tenant to pay the landlord, and they don't even have to know what's going on. Unfortunately, where I live, they didn't do that. And another problem that we had where I am is that the entity that is giving out most of this money requires you to give a valid lease to prove that you're renting. And as I mentioned earlier, many, many, many low-income clients don't have a lease. So that became a problem that prevented many people from getting the money. And again, this program doesn't help you unless you are being evicted for non-payment of rent related to COVID. So there are thousands and thousands of people who are left out of this help. If you had another reason that you couldn't pay your rent, my car broke down and I couldn't get to work or whatever, you're out of luck. It won't cover you. Now, that's not to say that some There are some local charities across the country that might help people like that, but the vast amount of money out there is only if you're COVID related. Okay, so the next slide. So I just want to take a little look at sort of the micro picture, just to give you a sort of snapshot of what it looks like on a local level. So these slides, by the way, are thanks to Michael Desmond's Eviction Lab. He has done a really exciting effort to collect eviction data. And again, I will say because of him, I was able to convince our state to start coding eviction cases in a way that we could actually track them. Complicated to explain what was going on before, but we now have a better picture. So this is just looking at Indiana overall. Why Indiana is somewhat important is Indiana, 3 cities in Indiana, the one I live in, South Bend, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Indianapolis, Indiana, have 3 of the highest eviction rates in the country. And so, because we have some of the very worst landlord-tenant laws in the country, but so it is, it's a snapshot of that. But what this shows, so if you look at that first little block, it's hard to see here, but it's kind of shaded gray. That was during the moratorium, and you see how evictions really fell. Then they go up again, and then they sort of, taper off. They're still below their average, right? So the first was the Indiana moratorium. The next one is the Ddc moratorium. They're still below their average, but they've really come back up because, again, the Ddc moratorium doesn't cover everybody, and we had an awful lot of landlords who wouldn't participate. Next slide, please. Oh, while she's getting that next slide, this is South Bend. This is where I live. Now, again, I said South Bend has one of the highest rates in the country, and you can see sort of the same trend. It dipped during the moratorium, came back up, and the gray lines behind the red lines are the weekly filings, and you can see that we really are up. We're still not at our average, right? So there still are a lot of people being helped, but the numbers are really trending up, and it's been a bit of a crisis. I wanted to just explain really briefly how eviction process works here so that you have some sense. So as I mentioned, you have to go to court. And in Indiana, it's a very strange process. The court proceedings are bifurcated. So the first court proceeding is the actual eviction hearing, whether they say you've lost possession of the property or not. And then they held a second hearing where technically you can argue that if you were evicted, you can argue that it was a mistake. But by that point, you've had to find somewhere else to live for a month. So it's kind of moot. But in the second process, they assess any damages. If you owed past due rent, there were damages to the property. One of the things that happened during COVID, which again has had mixed reviews, is they started to do a lot of these hearings remotely by Zoom, by WebEx, by all the other platforms that are out there. In some sense, that was great for some clients because getting to court, transportation issues, we do not have a very good transportation infrastructure here in Indiana. It's even worse. But for many other low-income clients, that was a disaster because they didn't have the computer capacity, they didn't know how to use it, especially elderly clients. Most of the time, I have a friend right now who's doing a study on this. It's quite interesting. Most of the time, they were trying to appear by phone, and you couldn't see them or hear them. They didn't understand how to put in exhibits. So if they had any kind of evidence, I paid the rent, I've got all my receipts. Well, they had to email those things into the court ahead of time, and most people didn't understand that. So these remote hearings, while they could be beneficial to some people, have really adversely affected low-income folks who didn't have the ability to do that. Because of COVID, they're still allowing remote hearings, and they're also allowing people to testify by telephone when they never used to do that before. And again, that can be very good for some people, but it's a mixed bag. All right, next slide, please. This is just, so if you see, these are the apartment complexes in South Bend that do the most evictions. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is to just point out, so Hickory Village, Irish Hills, the first 2, and then Village Green, which I think is number 5, and Indian Springs, number 6. They're all owned by the same company. And that company absolutely refused to cooperate with the governmental program. They wouldn't take the money. And as a result, they're evicting the most number of people. Um, and that's, and in that particular situation, I know because I talked to them. It was it was a political issue. It was this notion that the government shouldn't be involved in housing, shouldn't be telling me what to do, so we're not going to take any of the money. It is kind of a cutting off your nose to spite your face problem, but that's how they felt. Okay, next slide. There was a lot of concern during all these moratorium stuff that landlords were going to be, wiped out, weren't going to be able to survive, especially early on when there were moratorium without the money. And this is a very limited study. I want to point that out. But this was a study done by JP Morgan Chase, and they looked at all of their clients who were landlords who had accounts with them. So again, it's a different kind of study. But essentially what they showed was that while revenues were dipping, so were expenses. And in the end, the landlords really have more money now than they ever did. So that it didn't really hurt, especially the large landlords, very much. I do think that smaller landlords, people that owned one or two houses, did suffer through this. People who had to pay their mortgage. And this was one of the problems with the federal programs. The federal programs that helped you if you couldn't pay your mortgage excluded landlords. So if it was an investment property and you were renting it out, you couldn't get help with your mortgage. So people who weren't getting rent but still had to pay mortgages, smaller landlords really were being hurt. The federal government changed the program about halfway through this crisis to allow those landlords to also get mortgage help. So next slide. So what I really think the most important thing is that this whole thing has really laid bare the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is that we have a huge affordability problem across our country for renters. So you can show me the next slide. And many people couldn't get any kind of help, excuse me a second, because their issues weren't related to COVID, and they continue. So I'm stepping back again and looking at our housing crisis, the foreclosure crisis, and this is really kind of where it started. So this is a diagram of housing prices in the U.S. We had that housing bubble, then we had the crash of the foreclosure crisis. We have a huge bubble now, which I see really leading to problems. But what happened when those prices crashed was a lot of equity funds, hedge funds, those sorts of things came in and bought up all these properties. And they're either hanging on to them for investment purposes or they're renting them, but at much higher prices than had previously been done. There's not a lot of good statistics about how many of them, because the last sort of survey was done in 2018, and a lot of this activity has really been going on since 2020, and so we don't have a lot of good data. We know that investors are driving up prices. There's a lot of reports of investors making ridiculous cash offers, and so it's having two effects. It's driving up rentals, but it's also driving up housing prices for people who are trying to buy, and then of course they can't rent because the rentals are so high. They're coming in and making ridiculous cash offers. And I just have an anecdotal story of my son who was selling his home in Phoenix, Arizona, and like the day after he put it up on the market, one of these investors came in with a cash offer that was almost $100,000 more than his asking price. And he called me in a panic, like, is this illegal? I was like, unfortunately, no, it's not illegal. Take the money and run, basically. But we're hearing this all across the country. These investors are coming in with just ridiculous offers and buying up all the available housing. All right, next slide, please. So this next slide is a map of sort of rent affordability. It's a little hard to see, but the dark colors, with the very darkest colors, show the places where there are 30 or fewer affordable available homes for every 100 people. And the next number down, the sort of little lighter orange, is there are between 31 and 40. The next down is between 41 and 45. And then the lighter color is more than 45. So where I live in Indiana, there's about 31 to 40 houses available for every 100 people that need them. So rentals that are affordable. So that, is really highlighting the severe problem we have with rental affordability. The next one, please. And then the other problem is, this is a chart of what the median rent for available units is. So as you can see, rental prices have just skyrocketed across the country. In the last, even if you just look at the last 10 years, you can see the huge spike. And so where in 1997, the average rental was, about $450 a month, now it's up over $1,200. And this isn't even, when you're looking for more than 1 or 2 bedrooms, it's even worse. Next slide, please. So the real problem we've got is this gap, right? So we have, and this is a diagram from the National, I can't remember their name now, National Low Income Housing Coalition. And what it shows is, so you've got an awful lot of people who can afford all of the units that are out there. Well, if I can afford all the units out there, many of those people aren't going to rent the most expensive ones, right? And this continues down. And when you get towards the bottom, you've got 10.8 million households, but only 7.4 million units, right? And part of that problem is that even those units that are available, people who make more money, who could afford something more expensive, are renting the cheaper units. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of our sort of governmental programs, we haven't built new housing assistance units in decades and decades and decades. So while there are low income housing units of it, across the country, there's multiple problems with them. They're in horrible shape. They haven't been maintained. There are not enough of them. Our second program that assists people who are low income called the Housing Choice Vouchers, which basically gives you a voucher to go out and rent in the community. There are so few of them that most places that even have a waiting list, the waiting list is 5 or 10 years long. We haven't opened up our list for years. I think they just opened it up to allow people to apply because there are no vouchers available. So even though we've got these programs, nobody can really use them. And just, again, my local community is a microcosm here of what's happening across the country. But we have 2 low-income housing units, apartment buildings in South Bend, the Rabbi Schulman and the Monroe Circle. And together they house about 150 people. Both of those have been condemned and have to be torn down. And, essentially nobody knows where those folks are going to go live. We had another unit called Miami Hills, and I spoke to the folks at HUD about this place years ago, and asked them why they were not condemning it, because it should have been condemned. And they told me that they knew it should be condemned, but if they condemned it, they had nowhere to put the people, so they were leaving it in that horrible position, letting people live in it. I think I have one more slide. Yeah. And this is just, again, going back to my local community. Housing is considered affordable if you're paying, around 35 to 37% of your income on housing. And this shows here in Indiana, over half the people are paying. No, I'm sorry, I shouldn't put it that way. About a quarter of the people are paying more than half their income. And if you look at those who are paying above 30%, it adds up to, about half the people are basically rent burdened, paying more than they can afford on rent, but they don't have any other choice. Okay, that's all I have to say. I have some, if people have questions or comments, or love to hear them.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I have a few questions myself, but I first want to give the floor to others who want to ask questions. So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand virtually, physically, or you can ask a question in the chat, of course. No one with questions? Then yeah, Lisa, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Professor Fox, for a really interesting presentation there. I'm kind of fascinated by seeing it in a multi-jurisdictional and seeing how things work in different countries and so on. And one thing I'm always fascinated with is in the UK, it's very, very difficult to get any data on court hearings for eviction. They're not reported. They kind of, take place behind closed doors almost. So in the States, what's the provision there for monitoring these cases? I know you said at one point that you were able to ask for certain information from the courts for it to be recorded in a particular way. What kind of access do researchers get to these cases?
It's scattershot. And that's, again, I have to really thank Michael Desmond for that, because he really started to raise awareness that this was a problem and got many court allied groups to say, hey, we've got a problem here. So once it goes to court, there's going to be a record that you can obtain. The problem is some jurisdictions have housing courts, and that makes it easy, right? Because you can know everything that happens in there. What was going on in our situation, and this is a situation really very similar across the country, most of these evictions happen in what's called small claims court. And there's a whole bunch of other kinds of cases that happen in small claims court. And the way that the courts recorded them, you couldn't tell if it was an eviction or debt collection unless you actually went in and pulled files, which is really time consuming. I've done it, but it's really time consuming. Now, many courts, again, partly because of Michael's efforts and also because of COVID, have gone in and changed their coding systems. So as of last January, our court is now specifically coding evictions as evictions. So you can just pull court data. That's much easier. The problem we still have is that there are an awful lot of what we call informal evictions, where somebody gets a notice and moves out before they ever go to court. And those are almost impossible to track. And so there's still a big gap there. But what I will say is we have a whole lot more data now than we had 5 years ago, because the courts have now started to pay attention to at least coding them. It's still hard the way that these things are done, because small claims courts are so haphazard and busy and whatever that you do get sort of gaps in the records, but it's better than it used to be. And that's helped a lot, being able to get a picture of them. There's been a couple good studies out of New York City Housing Court, for instance, trying to look at whether it's kind of one of the things Michael Desmond said is that eviction causes poverty, and researchers are trying to figure out, is it poverty causing eviction or eviction causing poverty? And obviously it's a little bit of both, right? People are poor, so they get evicted, but then they're more poor. That's dramatically horrible. But and one of the shocking things that I learned in this whole process recently, I work very closely with a not-for-profit in our community who helps people pay their rent. And that's one of those places that will help people pay their rent, even if it's not COVID related. And so I've become very involved in working with them. And they told me that the most common request that they get from people looking for help is for beds. And it's because they get evicted, they have nowhere to put their stuff, they leave their beds. They take their clothes, whatever, and leave their beds, and then they're trying to start all over again, and they need beds. And that, to me, is just tragic. But also, it does show you how the poverty continues then, because you're starting all over and over again.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that we've seen a lot of similarities on how COVID has affected the housing market.
Mm-hmm.
What I was wondering, or what caught to me, is the difference that you mentioned between the different types of landlords. So that smaller landlords are, of course, in a very different way affected by these eviction moratoriums. And I was wondering, how does the sort of landlord market looks like in the US? What is the portion of smaller sort of hobby landlords that only do that for their own income or for their retirement, for example?
So that's the piece that we're all struggling with right now. So in 2018, which is when we have the last, so our government does this housing survey every so many years. 2018 is the last time we have data. And so at that point in time, it was a little more than half, let's say, were sort of small landlords. All of the indications are that has really changed because of the number of, first of all, the size increasing and some of the companies that now own multiple units. The numbers, the monies that's being spent by hedge funds and private equity firms buying up apartment buildings and buying up low-income housing. Buying up single-family housings to rent is about the hottest market right now. There is. So there is a real sense out there that that number has shrunk considerably. And we're now looking, and again, these are estimates people are making, but that now we're looking at about 70% of housing is owned by, corporations or Wall Street. I don't know that we've got really great data on it. It's, people are extrapolating from the fact that these companies are buying up single family properties in just unprecedented ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. We within the EVICT project, we focus a lot on the impact of the right to housing. And of course, I think one of the most important reasons is that the right to housing doesn't really have that strong of an impact because of the right to property. And I'm
Right.
wondering if the strength of the right to property also, or the impact or the effect of the right to property is also depending on what kind of landlord is suing for an eviction.
Not particularly, though there is an incredibly strong bias essentially towards the property owners. And this comes out, and I'll say that there are a couple states that give, like New Jersey and Massachusetts, give much better protections to their tenants, right? But as an overarching theme, it's the right to exclude people from property you own is really considered a fundamental right, and the right to not have to contract with somebody is considered a more important right than the right for someone to have a house. And this becomes a problem too when we're trying to litigate some of these things, because one of the things I do a lot is litigate when someone is renting a home and the home gets condemned because they've not maintained it, and then suddenly the tenant is out of a house. And to me, if I signed a lease for a year and after 2 months I get thrown out, you should find me a place to live for the other 10 months. But that argument has not been showing to be a winning argument, because again, the right of the landlord to say, well, I have to fix this up, and or I want to sell it, which is usually what happens. I want to sell it, it's condemned, I want to sell it. Almost always trumps, because they look at the economic value of the property, not the sort of need for someone to be housed.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the measures that are taking against investors? Because we have the same problem in the Netherlands, these big investors buying up houses. But we have a huge housing crisis in the Netherlands as well. So we came up with the measure against investors that for homes that are now built, the owner that buys the house needs to live in that house for at least a year. Is that a measure that has also been taken by other states?
There are some local communities that have tried to do those kinds of things. For instance, New York City has been working on a pretty high tax, that if you buy a property and aren't living in it, it's not your primary residence, then you have a really high tax. There's lots of constitutional problems with that, because other entities, we tried it here. I've tried to put in measured against landlords that don't live in the community, like out-of-state landlords, because they're usually people who are buying them for investments usually don't live here, right? And so far, not a lot of those have been successful, except in some, scattered localities around the country who have been trying this. But no, right now, and again, our government, there's very much an attitude of supporting capital over all else. And so if lots of people are getting rich, why should we care? But the problem is lots more people are getting poor, right? So there isn't any, I would say, concerted consensus effort to do anything about that, even though a lot of people are raising the issue and saying this is a problem. And again, we've got a bubble. I mean, we've got a huge bubble. It's gonna break. It has to break. This just can't keep going on. And ironically, that'll be when all of a sudden we're concerned about it, which frustrates me because we can see it happening.
Yeah. I wonder if the bubble breaks at the same time at this part of the ocean. Wellington, I think that you have a question, right? Posted in the chat.
Yes, I just now written the question in the chat, but I can repeat it here. It's quite simple. Professor Fox, do you see any correlation between evictions and people having problems to access law courts?
Yes. One of the big problems that we've been trying to address is the fact that landlords are almost always represented by counsel. Tenants are almost never represented by counsel. There's no right to counsel for tenants. A couple states, again, New York, which always seems to be leading this kind of things, have in some of their courts put in the right to get appointed counsel. But you know, when you're facing an experienced attorney who's been doing these a lot of over and over again, and you're a landlord, and many times tenants have defenses that they don't realize. Like I said, I come in and do some of these, and you know, you can win because there are lots of things wrong lots of times, but tenants don't know that. They don't know that they have defenses. They don't know how to bring them. And so a couple studies have been done that shows a real sense of, if you have an attorney, that you can win. And probably so there's two probably big movements across our country right now. One is to create a right of counsel in eviction cases. And the other one is many states, a couple states have enacted laws. We've got one that's working its way through our legislature. Hopefully it'll pass to allow expungement of eviction records. Because the other problem we have is if you have one eviction on your record, that's it, no one will rent to you. And even if you've gone into court and won, because it shows up as a court record and it's very hard to tell what happened. So the idea would be well, there's two sets of ideas. One idea is if you won, if you went to court and you weren't evicted, it shouldn't show up on the record. Now, those of us who are researchers are probably out there going, oh no, but I want to see that. But it's better for the tenant if it doesn't show up on the record. The second move would be, like you can do with criminal records across the country, after 5 years, you should be able to go back and expunge it. Because one thing we're really finding is that if you've got any kind of eviction on your record, finding any landlord who will rent to you is very difficult. And I apologize.
Thank you so much.
I don't know where to find the chat, so.
No problem. This was the only one that was in the chat. But Emma Boer, I see you have a question. Your mic is still off.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, because you had spoken about like low-income tenants who were just renting month to month and didn't have leases. Is this like under the table, you know, or is it actually legal for landlords to rent that way?
It's completely legal. You're required, if you're one of those housing choice vouchers I mentioned, which are given to low-income folks, the landlord is required for the first year for them to be on a lease. But at the end of that first year, then they can become rent month to month. And most landlords want them to be month to month. And the reason they want them to be month to month is then I can evict you for any reason at all. You make me mad, I can evict you. You ask me to fix the toilet, I can evict you. And so a very large percentage, and there are very, very few places, again, a couple cities where you're required to have a lease. Very few places. So a lot of low-income tenants are month to month.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Vinnie, please go ahead.
Oh, hi.
Yes.
So can you hear me? Yeah, I want to say thanks for the great presentation. Also, you mentioned that a few letting companies didn't want to take the government. And I was just wondering, like, why the government even gave this as an option, because it really seems to undermine the system of protection against evictions at all.
Yes, and I totally agree with you. In the first round of money, I think it just didn't occur to them that people would turn down money. They changed the program in the second and third rounds of money to let the grantees who get the money have that option of giving the money directly to the tenant. and sort of bypassing the landlord. But you've got, I mean, again, part of it is political. So the entity in my community, for instance, that was administering the money, sorry to be political, but I will be, has a lot of Republicans who are terribly afraid that some poor person might get more money than they deserve, and they're all worried about fraud. So they want the landlords to verify with a lease or with something else what money is due. And if you can't get the landlord to cooperate, you're out of luck. So even if you show up with a letter from the landlord saying, I owe $2,000, they wanted the landlord to verify that, and we had trouble getting the landlords to do that. So that piece of it in the second and third rounds, the government did change some of the requirements, but some of the local communities didn't. So we still have this sort of mismatch. But in many of the bigger cities across the country, the entities can give money directly to the tenant to pay the rent to avoid those landlords who don't want. The other problem with it is that, it takes time to process these. And so there's this, gap, depending on where you live, it could take a month to get the money, and you could be evicted by then. Because you can evict somebody here in, under a week. And when you get evicted in Indiana, you have 48 hours to move out.
Is there anyone who wants to question? I have okay, yeah, Dr. Balano, please go ahead. You have your microphone still off. I can't, no, I cannot hear you. No, still no sound, I'm sorry. Dr. Balano, you still have your microphone off.
See, I just found the chat room now.
Ah.
Okay. So you wanted to type it in there now that I figured out how to read
you
it.
can, yeah, exactly. We still cannot hear you, but maybe you can type your question in the chat. And in the meantime, I can ask maybe one of the last questions, because I think that's perfect. Yeah, we still have 5 more minutes left. Well, I was wondering, where do you see this going? Because as you already saw in the chart, there was a complete drop when the eviction moratorium was installed, and then now you see that it's sort of turning back to normal. Well, I would expect actually that you see an enormous peak after the end of the eviction moratorium. Where do you think, is this like stabilizing? Where do you think it's ending?
So I think when the money runs out, it's going to spike. There's still money out there. It's slowly running out in communities. So for instance, locally, our eviction numbers seem to be way down because we're getting a lot of cooperation, both from the courts, and I would say a lot of pressure from the courts. So people come in and landlords are saying they don't want to cooperate. The courts are really putting pressure on them. That's not happening everywhere in the country, but I've been depressing people all over the place with this. I've been doing this for a long time. I've never, ever, ever seen it as bad as it is right now. And I really have to tell people when they're being evicted, you will be homeless. There's no housing available, none. So I see a homelessness crisis coming. I just don't know what else to say. Our homeless center and all of our sort of transitional emergency housing is full and has been for probably a year. People are doubling up with relatives, but that can, and we're finding actually more and more people coming into court because they let a relative live with them, so the landlord's not evicting them because they have people living with them that weren't on the lease. So I see a crisis, and I see I just don't see it going anywhere well unless people start to take, and I'm talking about policymakers, start to take action now. I mean, the big problem is we now, policymakers are saying, oh yeah, we get it, we need more affordable housing, but it's going to take 5 or 10 years to build that housing. And nobody seems to be thinking about, well, what are we going to do in the meantime with all these people? Again, I keep pushing back to this idea that people have a right to housing, and that if the government then is going to have to find a way to house them. That's not a popular position in America, but it's a really bad situation. I really don't know where it's going, except that it's going bad.
Yeah, it's really shocking.
Yeah.
Okay, we have the final question in the chat. Question of Dr. Balano is, what happens to the evicted? Do they become homeless? Does the state provide alternative housing?
No, they become homeless. The state doesn't provide alternative housing. There are a couple communities, New York, some in Massachusetts, that have a requirement that the government has to find alternative housing. Right now, we've got charities. I mentioned one of them, St. Vincent de Paul, that is putting people up in hotels. But again, they're running out of money. I talked to them yesterday. They're running out of money. And that's why I think we've got a real crisis coming, because we have found, because of COVID, there are many empty hotels. And so some of those have very wonderfully stepped up to either provide, really cheap rates or even let people stay for free. But as COVID is waning and people are now starting to travel again, we're finding those hotels pulling back because, again, they've got paying customers coming now. So that's why I see a crisis coming, because the homeless centers are filled. The hotels are now starting to pull back their willingness to provide this housing, as they have been. And I have to say, in some, at least locally, again, because people aren't traveling, we have a lot of empty hotels and they have been housing people. But I mean, at least 2 of them that I know have just essentially pulled out of the program this week because people are starting to come and stay. So that's why I see a crisis coming. I mean, I think we're in a crisis, but I think it's really going to come to a head.
Thank you so much for this very interesting, but also very shocking and disturbing presentation. And you said it yourself, it's also quite a depressing, depressing information.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'd be very interested, anybody who's here, they wanted to email me. I'm very easy to find. It's just jfox@nd.edu. I'd love to know what's going on in other parts of the country or the world.
Thank you. Yeah, please join our monthly talks, because it's very interesting to see these speakers from, well, basically all over the world.
I've been trying. My classes keep getting in the way, but I'll keep trying.
Yeah, sure. All the talks are recorded and posted on the website. So there's this menu which is called blogs and videos, and you can rewatch all the previous sessions.
I will do that then. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. And thank you all for showing up, and we hope to see you in our next EVICT talk in March.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.